Hi everyone and welcome. We're going to start the event now. Please take your seats. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Jess. I am co-founder of Private Education Policy Forum, and I'm an investigative journalist as well in my day job. I hope this is okay. Is this okay? Yeah. And we are a think tank. We're the only think tank in the UK dedicated to the very hot potato political topic of private schools and fee-paying education. And we aim to platform research and debate around reducing inequalities. Thank you so much for coming on your Thursday evening. Sorry that it's so rainy. We're actually going to the pub afterwards. We're going to crack on with the evening, but we basically have 5 speakers for you, and I'm just going to ask them to come and take their seats now. And our first speaker is Francis. He's going to be in the hot seat first. And what we're going to do is we're going to speak to each of them. Each of them has a different perspective or view on the question that is up on the screen behind me, which is taxes and private schools. And each person kind of has a different view, a different area of expertise. And we're going to go through kind of chatting to each one, and then it's open to you guys. And at the very end, there is a poll. You may already have your view on private schools and tax. Let's see if you change it during the course of the evening. And you can vote in the poll. And then, as I said, you're very welcome to join us in the pub. I'm just going to do a tiny bit of housekeeping before we begin. Just want to say thank you so much to, let me get this right, the Community Co-Conference live stream in a collaboration with Steam Co, which is a non-profit community enterprise, co-founded and led by Nick Corsten, who is over here and doing our tech tonight, who is a community art activist and a dad at our host school, Ackland Burley. So we're very grateful to him, very grateful to the school as well. And he has some pretty cool projects going on, which is what these are about. So do take a look. Please share your thoughts and questions as we go on social media if you want to. Be aware that if you do, we might be sharing them, and therefore your views might end up on the screen. We're also filming tonight, and we've got some journalists in the house as well, so always good to know if someone's about to take you down on record, I guess. And apart from that, Wi-Fi details are on the screen, so you can get connected up on there. Now, on with the show. I'm going to give you a very quick breakdown, first of all, of just the topic, like a real mini one. But as I'm sure lots of you know, there are about 2,000 or more private schools in the UK. A bunch of those are with an organisation called the Independent Schools Council, about 1,300 of them, and 70% of those have charitable status. So not all private schools have charitable status at all, but all of the ones that you think of when you think of private schools do. And that means that they're exempt from corporation tax, from something called local business rates, which is a tax that's paid to the local authority, capital gains tax, which I found out this afternoon is if you sell shares or assets and you make a bit of money on it. And also the school fees are exempt from value added tax, which is what we slap on things we think are a luxury good. So corporation tax, local business rates, capital gains tax, VAT. So what is the charitable purpose of private schools? Is it to help the disadvantaged? Is that what they're meant to be for? Is it the advancement of education? Is that what they're for? Are they not-for-profit institutions? How transparent are they about what their charitable activities are? What impact do those charitable activities have? And at the same time, what effect would removing these tax exemptions be? And you all know why this is in the news, because Labour under Keir Starmer, carrying on the baton from the 2017 election manifesto, is saying that he will be applying VAT to private schools and possibly, intending to remove charitable status in order to do that. It's especially interesting to do this in Camden. Does anybody want to guess how many private schools are in Camden? Go on, shout me out a figure. Ah, not too bad, 32. Someone says 32. Lots of them are quite small. So that's 32 private schools, Camden. Great place to have this debate. And thank you so much to everybody for coming tonight. I'm now going to, with no further ado, come on to the wonderful Professor Francis Green, who is a PEPF co-founder. And more importantly, he is Professor of Work and Education Economics at the prestigious UCL Institute of Education. So Francis, this isn't the first time that anyone in the world has discussed this issue. What is the history of private schools and tax status?
The private schools in Britain go back 600 or 700 years, and so does charitable status really go back. They were founded as charities. They were founded as schools for the poor. The problem is that over the years, over the centuries, while they continued to be charities, they stopped being charitable. They basically became sinecures for the rich. And by the 19th century, it was a national scandal, really, so that there were lots of debates, there were commissions held in Parliament during the 1860s, and all of that was not so much as to try and remove charitable status, but just to bring the schools under some kind of control so that they were, quotes, to be charitable rather than just educating the rich and usually wasting the money of the rich, in fact. So in fact, the history goes back a very long way, basically.
Oh, thanks, Francis. Yeah, there was the 2006 Act, wasn't there? And then the 2011 kind of challenge. Can you tell us about those two?
The 2006 Act was an act about charities in general, not about specifically about schools, but it meant that all charities from then onwards had to be specific about the public benefit that they were going to deliver. They couldn't just reap the benefits of the tax benefits of that status willy-nilly. They had to somehow justify it in terms of by providing a public benefit in some way. Now, the 2011 case arose because the Charity Commission interpreted the 2006 Act in a particular way and attempted to impose an obligation on the schools to provide so much in way of bursaries and so on and so forth. And the independent schools felt that it was up to them to decide how to provide the public benefit and at what level. And it finished up with a resolution in the 2011 that, yes, a public benefit had to be provided, but that the Charities Commission, which is supposed to regulate the private schools, couldn't tell them how to do it. They could, if a school wanted to do it by providing lots and lots of bursaries, fine, but if it wanted to do it in another way, as long as they were making beyond some kind of minimal threshold, then they were still okay to be charities. That's how I understand it.
Yeah.
I'm not the lawyer, by the way, I'm an economist.
That's my understanding as well. So could you tell us about what that means, having that status, Francis, for, say, VAT? What has been the figure, suppose, that would be raised if VAT was applied on? We'll come on to whether or not it should be applied on.
The figure being bandied around is of the order of about £1.7 billion a year.
Yeah.
Which sounds a lot, but it's not all that much in relation to the total education budget, for example. So yes, it's a lot of money to you and me, but it's and I'm sure any future chancellor wouldn't say no to an extra boost of that size, but it's not like equal to the anywhere near.
I think it's about £39 billion. Yeah, the education budget.
£39 billion about 4 or 5 years ago.
Oh, right, okay.
More than that now, I think.
Yeah. And the local business rates, Reef, again, how much is that? We did a report on local business rates. So how much is that estimated to bring in a year?
That was going to be about the order of £150 million a year. That's in England and Wales, not in Scotland. So this is because private schools are obliged to pay 20% of what they would otherwise pay. So they do pay business rates, but only 1/5 of it.
Whereas state schools are required to pay 100%, but we'll come on to some sort of areas around that aren't quite the same.
Yes.
But so an 80% tax relief.
There are some nuances around there, but if they were required to pay business rates in full, then it will be a total of £150 million a year, that order of magnitude, as far as we could tell from our research. Incidentally, this is something that has changed in the last year in Scotland through an independent review of business rates in Scotland. that started just before the pandemic and was delayed and has now been put into effect, so that all the private schools in Scotland now pay a full business rate.
They pay full business rate. But VAT isn't being applied in Scotland, is my understanding.
No.
No.
VAT is determined by the Chancellor.
Yeah. Okay, so what's your view on the removal of charitable status for private schools in England, Francis? Or to apply remove any of those tax exemptions?
My view is that both sides of the debate exaggerate its effects. My view is that it will raise some money. A small amount of parents will find it impossible to keep their children in those schools. More likely, some other parents might not even send their children to school in a private school instead of the state school nearby. And this will happen over a course of time. So perhaps the best estimate by economists is of the order of, let's say, 20,000 pupils. That's in relation to 500,000 pupils across the country in private.
Would move into the state sector?
500,000 pupils more would move into the state sector than would otherwise do so. So in other words, 20,000 pupils would move from the private sector into the state sector. So if you look at the situation in 5 years' time, there were going to be like 20,000 or so more pupils than if there was no change in the tax regime.
Got it. That's not what Jeremy Hunt said at the dispatch box, is it? Do you remember what Jeremy Hunt said? Otherwise
I wasn't listening to what Jeremy Hunt said.
So not very long ago, he said that it was about 90,000, and he got on a bit of hot water because it turned out that's what the Independent Schools Council had said, which is a lobby group for the private school sector. And then there was some calculation done by the Institute for Fiscal Studies back in 2011 sometime, but the same situation, same number of pupils, and they'd estimated closer to what you've just said, I think, Francis.
Yes, the estimate would be of the order of 20,000, could be 30,000. One has to admit there's a sort of error in these estimates of how people actually do respond to price changes. That's like the business of economists, what my colleagues in the Institute of Fiscal Studies did, and that's the number that they found. And so it completely contrasted with the report, which was what Jeremy Hunt's statement was based on, which said it is going to be definitely 90,000 children switching over, and possibly a lot more than that.
Right.
It just seemed to me a number that came out of, I don't know where that number came from.
I did read an opinion piece in the Metro the other day from a teacher who was like, oh my gosh, please don't give me any more children. We don't have enough space for them as it is. And that's obviously something that has been raised as a concern. What's your view on that? What's the evidence on that, Francis, that there's not space in the state sector for those 20,000 students?
The answer to that kind of follows on from my previous answer, really, that there are going to be far fewer pupils who will move over. There'll be some adjustments that have to be made, and I'm not saying there won't be any schools which are kind of on the margins of survival which will be troubled by this and may close. I mean, schools close and open up all the time. We don't hear about them very much, but they close and open up all the time, a few every year, and so there may be some more of them, but
the point that the state sector could or couldn't cope with it, I guess, is what I was asking.
This is at a time where, at least in some areas, for example, in Camden, which is, as you said, one of the most private school dense boroughs in the whole country, in this particular borough, there's a great issue about falling school rolls. So there's going to be oodles of places, as it happens in Camden, but there may be other areas in other parts of the country where that's not the case.
Right.
So I can't stand here and say there won't be any problems over placing children in schools, and some more parents might not get their first choice than otherwise would.
No, great, thanks, Francis. And last but not least, all of these private schools that aren't charities, are we thinking enough about those in this whole debate? Is that actually almost a bigger question? Is the for-profit charities, many of them very small, many of them small religious schools, outside of Ofsted. Is that more of a concern than the large schools like Eton with 600 million in assets and charitable status?
I wouldn't say it's more of a concern, but I think it just illustrates how little this will do. This will change. If you are looking for this to suddenly reform drastically the whole of the private school sector, if you're on the side of you want a lot of reform, then you would be disappointed if this was the only thing that happened in the next 20 years.
What would you like to see happen, Francis?
But
and go on, hit me with your best reform.
Well, for me, I am a reformer. I want to make the schools more integrated so that we don't have such a drastically socially segmented schooling system in this country with all the social problems that gives rise to. And so I would be in favor of bringing about, if necessary by regulation and direction, some systematic integration of state school children into some of the private schools. This is not something that wholesale. I mean, I've put forward the figure of 30% in gradually cohort by cohort, and it seems to me that's something which is perfectly feasible to do. And I've had some discussions with the chair of the Independent Schools Commission and suggested ways in which this might work. It'd probably work in different ways in different parts of the country, but a serious attempt to have an integrated, a more socially mixed group of people in these in the private schools.
So
that seems to me the only way to get a serious reform in the long term.
Got it. And final question, Francis. If we did have 30% of places in private schools completely means tested, let's say 100% free for the most disadvantaged students, actually, should private schools then keep charitable status under that reform, in your view?
I don't care. I don't think it would matter in that situation, isn't it? It's the problem will be solved anyway.
Got it. Okay. Thanks so much, Francis. Round of applause for Francis for that great answer. Yeah. And Tilly, please. So next we have Tilly Clough, who is a graduate teaching fellow at the University of Liverpool, and she's specialising in charity law and policy. So I think we have somebody who can tell us a little bit about the nitty-gritty. So much for joining us, Tilly.
Thank you.
Great to have you here. Could you tell me a little bit about the obligations that private schools with charitable status are actually under? Like, what's the facts? What do they have to do and not do? And feel free to compare between England, Scotland, Wales.
So I think everyone sees the law surrounding charitable status as quite complex, because I think lawyers have a tendency of talking things up to make them sound quite complex. But in reality, the obligations are reasonably clear. So to be a charity, in the kind of legal sense of the term, you need to have a charitable purpose and you need to have public benefit. So that charitable purpose has to be for the public benefit. So the actual charitable purpose, it's quite uncontroversial within law that it does fit under the advancement of education. As Francis says, advancement of education has been around since charities began. It's been quite an uncontroversial charitable purpose. But for public benefit, that's when it gets a little bit more interesting. So specifically, it's not defined in law. So public benefit isn't defined anywhere in statute, and it's developed over cases for several hundred years. It fits within equity and trust, which has been developing for years and years, hundreds of years. And essentially it means that you have to have some benefit, and that's weighed against harm or any kind of detriment, and it has to benefit the public. So the law says that you actually you have to have a sufficient section of the public that has to be able to benefit. And that's where it gets a little bit controversial with the charitable independent schools, because they do say you can charge high fees, which is where they're allowed to kind of, specifically do that. But they said that the education for this specific section of the public that can obviously afford these fees isn't enough to be their whole public benefit.
Right.
So they have to open up their doors in different ways, whether it be fee assistance, bursaries, scholarships, whether it be partnerships with state schools. What's interesting, and Francis touched on this, is that it's down to the independent schools themselves to decide on how they provide this public benefit and how much they provide.
In England?
Yeah.
So was that different in Scotland? My understanding is they were given a test, weren't they? Like an actual public benefit test.
Slightly different, yeah, because it was defined, but realistically it did seem to be kind of the same sort of substance to it. So public benefit is you have to have more than a token requirement for the poor. And that's quoted from statute, from the case law, the ISC case that Francis mentioned. But the case actually referred to, they said the poor actually could be defined as quite well off.
Right.
So it meant that you had to have a token requirement, so a minimum requirement to people who are quite well off. So the legal test is sort of on the floor, which means that it's down to the individual charities, the trustees of these schools, in order to decide how they provide this public benefit and how much they provide, as long as it's over this token requirement. So it means it's completely down to them. And it's also not regulated by the Charity Commission. Charity Commission doesn't check it. So that's another kind of controversial area.
Okay. So I guess the next question is, I don't know how much research you've done on this, but are private schools meeting those obligations?
Well, this is the problem. And so my PhD thesis is on the charitable status of independent schools. So I have spent many years researching exactly this issue. The problem is it's very difficult to know because only a certain amount we actually find out about. So the Charity Commission, which is the body that kind of governs these schools as charities, they don't check public benefit of these individual charities. So they used to, in 2009 was the last check of public benefit, and in that there was 5 charitable independent schools. 2 were found to not be providing public benefit, but...
So there was a sample size of 5 and 2 weren't?
Yes.
And we don't know about the rest?
No. So they were told that they had to improve their public benefit and they had to set out a plan, but they were not removed from the charities register or anything. They were just told to improve.
Okay.
But the problem is, because the legal test is so low, they just have to have a token requirement. It's quite difficult to prove that they're not meeting that if they're doing something. But the crucial thing, and the thing that I've focused on in my research, is that it's probably really varied. Eton probably provides a lot because it's checked on by the media and people will check it. But the smaller schools, might not be providing anything. They only have to provide a trustee annual report to the Charity Commission. And in my research, a lot of those schools don't really mention public benefit in those either. So it's not particularly useful for us because some might be providing loads of bursaries and some might be doing very little.
I did actually enjoy a open democracy investigation, which have found that I think it was Wickham Abbey had included in its charitable kind of public benefit listing, wherever it had to record it, the fact that it allowed the public to do tours of its World War II bunker on its grounds, and also that if the nursery next door had a fire, they could use their buildings.
Significant.
But then other places might be doing some really big stuff. But I guess your point is it's massively varied. And then what are the consequences if you're giving tours of a bunker but nothing else?
So as part of going through these kind of trustee annual reports and seeing how each different charitable independent school actually provides this public benefit, it's quite interesting because some of them say we give our leftover Easter eggs from our Easter egg hunt to the local food bank. But then some of them say that they give significant bursaries, and sometimes they're like 110% bursaries, which means it covers uniforms and school trips and stuff. Right. But often they're scholarships, and sometimes they go to the children of teachers at the school, sibling discounts. So if you've already had a sibling that goes to that school, you receive a discount. There's even one that I saw that had each year you get 5% off, which is quite interesting. Yeah. But what I'm trying to say is that it just varies massively. And that the law allows that because it doesn't check it, the Charity Commission doesn't check it. And the legal test is sort of so slim, so low.
So I don't know if you did this as part of your PhD, but did you come up with a reform? Would you reform the way the Charities Commission works with and checks on independent schools, or would you remove charitable status, or is it so pointless to do it anyway? What's your takeaway after your research?
It's quite difficult because my PhD is not focused on the reform so much, just kind of these are the issues and this is where it fits within law. But it is interesting because if you remove charitable status, then they remove the taxation benefits. So that's significant in a way, but equally the 50%, so out of the ISC schools, there's about 70% that are charities. I think it's just over 50% of all private schools are charities and hold this status. So if you removed their charitable status, they wouldn't have to provide any public benefit, even if the legal level is sort of on the floor. And potentially the oversight that the Charity Commission kind of provides with regulation is maybe a good thing. If these schools are quite independent, they're far away from the state regulation, it's not Ofsted in the same way as the Independent Schools Inspectorate, potentially it's not a bad thing to be able to sort of keep an eye on them. So I've always been, I think...
And that sounds like a bit more regulation rather than scrapping it. Better regulation rather than scrapping it is something to be considered.
Potentially, but I think the issue is that legally it's very difficult to do, because the ISC and Charity Commission case in 2011 came because the Charity Commission interpreted the Charities Act 2006 in a way that said, okay, we can regulate these schools now. We can actually tell them that they have to provide a certain amount of public benefit. So the Charity Commission said, okay, if you have high fees, you have to provide a high amount of public benefit. And that's what created the case that said that you now have to have a token requirement for the poor. So the Charity Commission has tried to change it, and I just don't think...
But the ISC won in 2011 to kind of mark their own homework. Is there any, is it possible in law to undo that 2011 case, or are we just sort of stuck with that now?
I think I'm sceptical because the Charity Commission did try, and they did something quite significant by changing the guidance for these schools. So I'm unconvinced that there'd be able to be such a change that the Charity Commission and the upper tribunal system could actually do something. I think reform is a lot more likely, I think, to come from kind of a political or governmental standpoint, and that's what the courts have said as well. The Charity Commission, like, sort of over to you.
Got it. And last question, if Labour went forward with this at the next election, do you think that a legal challenge against Labour's policy would be successful? Perhaps you don't know too much about that, but...
Hard to know on what grounds they call it on, really. It depends on what they specifically do, but it wouldn't surprise me the Independent Schools Council has a lot of kind of funding and would potentially do that as well. And the Charity Commission could get involved as well. So it's quite interesting to see where it'll go, really, because I'm unconvinced that it will start with the Charity Commission at this point, because they've been shot down before. Right. So potentially, if there's anything to do with the government and stuff that will get involved, it could be quite interesting to see.
Got it. I've just run one last question, which has always confused me. Lots of academies are charities as well, right?
Yes.
So how does that work? Are they then also exempt from a series of taxes, but then local authority schools are paying all the flipping taxes? Is that what's happening?
Well, so technically they're not registered charities. So they're a very specific type of charity, which is called an exempt charity. So they can't refer to themselves as a registered charity.
Right.
But technically, yes, they're independent schools. So we're talking about private schools, which are the fee-paying independent schools. So these are independent schools proper, and they can be an exempt charity, which means that you get taxation advantages.
Sorry, an academy, talking about, so an academy is an exempt charity?
Yes.
Private schools count as full charities? Full
charities,
right.
Yeah. So as a exempt charity, it means that you're not regulated by the Charity Commission. It means that they're regulated by the Department for Education instead, but they receive all the same taxation advantages.
Got it.
They're in the same category as universities.
Right. But local authority schools are having to pay full business rates to local authorities. So there's sort of several tiers of slight inequality of taxation then within, not just between private and state. Is that right? Would that be?
So academies count as independent schools. So that's the same kind of broad thing that the fee-paying private schools fit within. But equally, these exempt charities, they can be museums, art galleries, universities. There's loads of different exempt charities. But technically, they can't refer to themselves as registered charities.
Got it. We're not discussing academies, but that's always confused me. So, but that's a really interesting sort of load of information you've given there, Tilly, especially around kind of regulation versus actually scrapping it. So thank you very much for joining us. And next up, we've got Diana. Thanks, Tilly. And next we have Diana Young, who I'm really grateful for coming this evening, because she is a parent of a child in a private school, which I think is a really important perspective to have in these debates, and one that often gets forgotten. She's also a national newspaper opinion writer and a founder of her own PR company. So thank you very much, Diana, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
All the way from South London. As
Yeah.
Sorry about the rain.
It's okay.
Good. So I think, let's just hear from your perspective. If charitable status was removed, I think it's an estimated 15% increase in fees is what we're hearing. What would your view be on taking that as a parent?
I disagree with the change that Labour is proposing, because it means that essentially the fees will increase again by 15%. The school has already announced that they'll be increasing fees by around 10 to 15% by September.
Just your particular school?
My particular school.
Oh, right, okay.
In fact, my children's school is part of the GDSD group.
Right.
And so we're seeing quite a large increase by September, in addition to these proposed increases if we do see the VAT added onto fees. So I'm really, really worried about it, because there is this mindset that only wealthy parents can afford private school, when actually there are a lot of middle income earners who, I'll say sacrifice, although I'm sure that there's probably a few grimaces in the audience about sacrifice, but there are many parents that make that sacrifice in order to afford those fees for their children. So I think it will be extremely difficult.
Okay. I don't know if you've managed to chat to other parents, but whether there's a feeling that the school should be able to absorb that cost and not pass it on to the parent. Have you been able to talk to the school about, like, could you take that cost and cut several other things down, not pass it on? What's the feeling about that being a possibility?
Yes, I know that the school has remained quite tight-lipped on that particular issue, but they are carrying out a few surveys trying to find out from parents what is their view. In fact, trying to understand from parents, how do they fund the fees in the first place, because many have access to generational wealth, inheritance, grandparents, etc. So, savings or whatnot. So I think the school really wants to understand more about how people can afford private school in the first place. And then on the basis of those results, we'll make a decision. But I have heard a few rumours about the school absorbing some of those costs.
Some of it, but not all of it.
Not all of it, no.
Do you just, Percy, do you think, have you got a sense of how many parents, say, at your school feel they would actually have to remove their child, or do people feel like they'll just dig a bit deeper and cut in their own lives?
From what I've heard, in fact, there are many parents that have already taken the decision to remove their children at the end of the next term. So I'm seeing quite a few children leaving, and typically we see the year 3 children, the year 3 group increase, where we've got lots of new joiners from nearby schools. So it'd be interesting to see what happens come September. Mm-hmm. But I am part of a few parent network groups, and there are quite a few rumblings about the increase in costs, and many people considering whether or not it's something that is for the long term, and whether or not they can invest in tutors and try and get their children into grammar schools, or, looking at alternatives, essentially.
Got it. So I guess the really interesting question here is, so we're in a state comprehensive school. Obviously, Camden and going to school in London is not necessarily representative going to school everywhere in the country. But I can't remember quite, but over 80% of state schools are graded good or outstanding. Now, Ofsted's obviously not in any way foolproof. But we also see a lot of the top universities specifically trying to take in more students from state school backgrounds. And we have lots of state school teachers and students who would say, I had a great education, or I deliver a great education. Mm-hmm. So say if you were priced out of the private school sector, what is it about the state school sector, or what is it about the private school sector that makes you worried about that scenario for you and your children? Does that make sense to the question?
Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely. I think I have a different perspective in that I'm also a state school governor. So I have a completely different view, considering my children have been within the private school fee-paying sector since they were in nursery. And in fact, we've been part of this school, the GDSD school that they attend, for 8 years. So it's a long time for that view to be quite well formed in terms of the benefits of private school, in terms of what they gain access to, the resources that are available, and the fact that they are extremely advanced for their ages. Now, when you compare that with the children that attend the state school that I'm a governor for, they are essentially 70% are underperforming. And it's a London, inner city London school, and so I can see essentially what could happen to my children if they were exposed to that sort of environment. And it's quite difficult in that There are many children that don't speak English as the first language, which therefore puts a lot of pressure on the school's resources. There are also a lot of children that are classified as SEND, and therefore that eats into a lot of the school's resources because we're spending a lot more money on whether it's a teacher that specialises in dyslexia or dyspraxia. And so the school just don't have the budget to be able to, spread that across the school. There's a lot of focus on children with SEND.
There's Q&A at the end, but I promise you'll get to ask it. Yeah, totally hear what you're saying. In a different world in which, say, state schools were funded at £10,000 per pupil rather than the absolute paltry £5,000, even less at FE College, or something ridiculous like £4,000 per student. In a different world where there was a lot more funding per student and you didn't have those worries, would you rather that they were in that kind of socially mixed environment, or is there? I know you've written before about what going to private school can also do for black children. You've written about that very powerfully. Is there an ideal scenario in which you would be happy to make that shift if charitable status pushed you out, or is there
I'll
not
be
one?
honest, no, there isn't one, because in addition to the fact that state schools just don't have the resources, in case you hadn't noticed, I'm black and my children are also black, so I'm just pointing that out. And I feel that there are many other things that we need to contend with as a black parent, because there's so much research that proves that black children are actually subject to stereotype, racism, bias, othering, and it therefore means that the way that they're grouped, assessed, disciplined will be very different. And I speak from my own experience, growing up in South London, going to a school and not being pushed because the assumption was that you must come from a single parent family.
It's proven in research that there are these biases in marking.
Yeah, so you come from a single parent family, you don't have anyone to support you with your work, so therefore we won't bother to push you. Whereas at my children's fee-paying school, those children will be pushed no matter what, irrelevant of their background or their skin color. So what I really appreciate is that I feel like all of the children are on an even footing and everyone is pushed to do their absolute best. And even if they do spot that there's some, whether it's a development issue or if there's SEND to contend with, then the school will do their utmost to, reduce that gap and bring those children up to match that of their peers.
So there's something fundamentally different about being in a sector in which the parents are paying. Even if there's more money in the state system, you're saying there's something that fundamentally benefits your children, which is it's a really, really interesting.
There's
really
also the like-mindedness with parents in that, again, being a state school governor and having to go and meet some of those parents and then comparing that to the parents that are in the playground at my children's school, it's markedly different. And the attitudes are very different in terms of what support they might be prepared to provide for their children. Are they available to read every night with them? Are they bothered about homework? And there are just different attitudes. So without generalizing, I can say that there is a big difference between the two.
Okay, I'm going to let other speakers come on and kind of contend back on behalf of the state sector, but it's really good. The only final question I have, I guess, is we know that, so there's 8% of places in private schools that means tested bursaries, and 1% of those are completely free. So only 1% of all places are completely free for a sector that's 70% charitable. And I was checking through today, the Independent Schools Council produces its own census report every year, and partly because of COVID, but there's in a long report, there's only one page on public benefit. And all it said was the number of partnerships. So the reporting on it is quite, as a journalist, I cannot find out what's going on. And that 1% figure only came out in an education select committee because Barnaby Lennon, who's chair of the IC, did provide it, but it hadn't been known before that. So what's your view, Diana, on if only private schools had done more charitable work and been more transparent about it, Labour wouldn't have the political capital, because it turns out nearly a majority of the country don't think that private schools should have charitable status. They don't think they're doing enough to justify it. So how do you feel about that private schools have got themselves into this situation and therefore their parents? Does that make sense?
Yes, I think that there should be almost more accountability. You should have to
Right.
prove what you're doing. I came across a really interesting website yesterday. I can't remember what it's called, but I think it's part of the ISC network. And it's a website whereby you can search for your school or a school that you're interested in, a fee-paying school, and it gives you information about their charitable partnerships. Obviously, I searched for my children's school, and it highlighted all of the state schools that they're working with and the GCSEs that they supply and the resources that they provide. And I was really impressed at that. And I wish that was, more forthcoming. In fact, that should be on the school's website, and it's not.
Right.
I'm sure if I spoke to the head teacher, then she would share that information, but it should just be accessible. They should almost champion what they're doing for their local community.
And that 1% figure, would you support the Charity Commission, say, re-getting that power to actually give an objective test and say, sorry guys, 1% is not enough. You've got to hit close to 15%, let's say.
Yeah.
As a parent, would you support a more objective test on your private schools?
Absolutely, I would support that objective test. And just, it might be difficult to measure and to compare one school versus another in terms of what can be done, but that measure should increase, and there should be more that the school is made to do in order to meet that almost benchmark. Right,
it's a really brilliant and interesting range of views from Diana. So a big round of applause, please. Thank you so much, Diana. Next up, we have Lord Lucas. Sorry, Lord Lucas next, please. Thank you, Lord Lucas. There's a bit of a tangle. So again, great to have Lord Lucas. Also, now, is it Rafe or Ralph? Rafe Palmer. He is a Conservative backbencher in the House of Lords. He's also editor of the Good Schools Guide, which is a schools guide for state and private schools. So it's really good to have you here.
Good evening.
And he's actually a returning guest at PEPF, so we're particularly grateful to have him come up twice into the sort of lion's den, but not. So thank you so much, Lord Lucas. My first question is just simply, should independent schools have charitable status?
I think that's the wrong question to ask. I think the question to ask is, what do you want the relationship to be between independent schools and state schools? I don't think in any society that I can imagine that you're going to successfully prevent parents benefiting their own children through education. I mean, you can imagine a society that wouldn't, but I don't think we're headed that direction. If some parents are going to be doing that, advantaging their own children, then how practically do you spread that advantage more widely? So the sort of thing I might like to see is any independent school being required to take free of charge 10% of children nominated by local authorities, in other words, not at the choice of the school. Pupils who were agreed would benefit from that particular state school. Now, I'm sure parents would take that. Parents contribute a large chunk anyway by not sending their children to state schools. So the state benefits by about 6,000 quid a year for every parent who chooses independent education. So they're already big contributors. But to do a bit more would have the benefit, and I think they would see it as a benefit, of having a more mixed school.
Right. Do you think financially, what do you think financially would happen to schools if they were required to have 10% free places in the independent sector?
Well, I think that would then come on the fees, but there would be but if the state was prepared to say they can take their £6,000 a year with them, then you might say 20%.
Okay, so the local authority...
you could require an independent school took a flow of pupils that were not chosen by them. I think that's really important. The assisted places scheme was a complete fraud that are chosen by other people. And there are some independent schools that take kids out of local authority care and do it very successfully.
Could you just explain the assisted places scheme for anybody who doesn't know?
Sorry?
Could you just explain the assisted places scheme for anybody who doesn't know?
Oh, the assisted places scheme, look, that was a Thatcherite scheme.
Yeah.
I forget the date of it, but essentially it allowed the schools to subsidise the parents who would have sent the children there anyway.
Yeah.
So it was because it was at the school's choice who got the subsidy.
Right.
So,
Whereas this would be
and that just didn't work. And I think it needs to be
non-selective.
somebody else saying, no, these are the children we want you to educate.
Okay. And in order to keep charitable status, why shouldn't the private schools stump up their own money to fund those children into their schools? Why should the government and taxpayers still pay the £6,000 for those children? Does everybody understand the suggestion? It's for the government to pay £6,000 for a student that the local authority chooses to attend.
I think if the government paid nothing, then 10% of pupils is about what you could manage.
Okay.
But since these are children the government would be paying for anyway,
Mm-hmm.
then it isn't costing the government any extra that £6,000 should travel to the independent school. In which case, I think it would be sensible to look at 20% coming by local authority nomination. This would apply to charity schools and to schools which were proprietor owned.
Okay.
So it would be a condition of being an independent school.
So you're actually sort of a secret reformer, Lord Lucas.
The only reason we haven't gone down this road is that the Labour Party have blocked it. The Labour Party have said that this has been mooted and tried before. How do we reintegrate the sectors? And the stumbling block, from my point of view as a Conservative, has always been we can never get the Labour Party to commit. So if Keir Starmer was to do something like this, I'm absolutely certain the Conservatives would go along with it, because one of the effects of 20 years of fee inflation is that very few Conservative MPs can afford to send their children to independent schools. So there isn't that support in the Conservative Party for independent education in the way there used to be.
Okay.
There's a very strong support for parents who want to do well by their children.
Okay. I suppose for a lot of reformers, the concern isn't just about charitable status, isn't just kind of, are they taking in enough children on a free place? There's that symbolic thing, there's that symbolic issue as well of you've got some of the outcomes concern people. So that children are growing up throughout all of their school years in quite a socially exclusive group of children, and then have a lot more money spent on them, more likely to get into top universities.
Absolutely, and that would be one of my worries about squeezing parents out of the independent sector and losing those who are financially marginal, is you make the independent sector even more exclusive. And most parents do work very hard to advantage their own children. So increasing the separation, saying that private schooling is even more exclusive.
Yeah.
And those parents will find some way of looking after their children.
Yeah.
So I think you're getting the wrong answer if you go down that route.
It's a really interesting reform. I guess, so I think evidence shows that 96% of parents in private schools are in the 10% or higher earning bracket, or in the top 10% earning bracket. So it's already a very, very socially exclusive kind of experience for a child going through school. You don't meet a lot of people who aren't from this income bracket. Yeah. Do you think that the 10% that you're talking about, or 20%, would do enough to make them socially diverse schools? You've still got 80% of children from the top 10% of earners in the school. Would they possibly even feel like guinea pigs? Are you really creating a socially diverse school with your proposal?
I think you want to have an idea of where you're trying to end up. But it's a good first step.
Right. Would you increase it beyond 20%?
I mean, no reason why there shouldn't be. I mean, the old direct grant system, which the Labour Party destroyed, was 50-50. And I think people will be quite happy to get back there.
So 50 subsidised places for children that the local authority maybe chose 50%, and 50% of parents. So
it would be, but to have that as an objective would be great. But there's no point in us doing it as Conservatives if the Labour Party is going to chuck it out as soon as they get in. So it needs to come from the Labour Party. It needs to be the Labour Party saying this is how we would like to resolve the divide between private and state.
Right.
And I think there will be a strong chance of the Conservatives coming along with that, because they say, okay, if the Labour Party is doing it, this is a settlement that will last.
And what about schools? I think about, let me get this right, I think just under 50% of private schools are currently academically selective. So do you think there would be a pushback from the independent school sector about taking in possibly some of our some are perhaps our brightest, but also some of our most unsupported in the rest of their lives children into their system. Do you think the sector would sort of say, we don't have the expertise to do this? Certainly not to 50%, and particularly if they've been academically selective. How do you think the sector would respond to your...
You need a certain amount of time to let this work through. There are a lot of independent schools which are not selective in that way. Generally, to be successfully selective, you need to have enough children who are really keen on doing well academically to form an emotional core to the school. And then I think most other children get pulled up by that. So I don't think you need to be
Do you think
just
the sector agrees with you?
Just the top.
Yeah.
You need some of the top, but I don't see any reason why schools should judge themselves by how high up they are up the A-star league table.
Yeah.
It should be by how well they do by the children they have.
Do you think the ISC would support the 20, 30, 40% possibly that you would move towards?
Well, I'd see myself as being interested in what parents want rather than what the schools want.
No,
So,
But
so
I'm just
I think
asking.
it was really interesting that when there were last attempts to reunite the state and independent sectors, roughly half independent schools said that they would like to find a way of rejoining the state sector, but that if they did that, they would want to keep something of what they had at the moment, and not just so that sort of discussion of what if the only way of coming into the state sector is complete surrender, then most of them want to stay independent. If there is a way of living as part of a partnership, then a lot of, their history, as was pointed out, is as of charitable schools.
For the
And I
poor.
think a lot of parents will be really happy to see things go in that direction, but not if it's going to get turned over by the Labour Party. It has to be something that the Labour Party can live with.
Got it.
And I've never understood how we can get over that problem.
Got it. No, it's really interesting. I guess another way of flipping the question is, why is it that over all of these years, so I think in the 80s, the average private school fee amounted to about 20% of the country's median income, and it now amounts to about 50% of the country's median income. So just hugely out of reach of most people, well, 93% of people. And also the 1% figure has remained around that amount in all of that time, 1% free places. Just genuinely asking, why is it that the independent school sector hasn't done more over that time to increase the number of free places for poorer students? Do you have any idea why?
I think part of the problem is parents, because they like to be seen to go to a school which is evidently on good form, rather than one that is having to cut costs and being sparing with its money. So there's that sort of pride of going to a school which is at the top of the heap. And the other is that it's been generally pretty hard to find new independent schools, mostly planning permission problems. People don't like to live next to a school. They've not been encouraged. So the numbers of schools haven't grown to the extent that they would. So various problems, but can you provide a good education for what the state offers? Yes, James Tooley has founded an independent school in Newcastle that charges less.
He does, but it has got a good Ofsted, but do we know how good it is? We don't. It's only been around for a few years.
No, I don't. But do the fees need to be where they are at the moment? No, they don't.
I see. Yeah. No.
And that's one of the things about trying to reform through putting VAT on. It is the potential for the schools to say, actually, we learned a lot through COVID. There's a lot you can do through online learning now. We don't need to be charging this. We can just drop our costs.
Yeah. I suppose my only thought is, even if parents are a bit uncomfortable with the idea of, normal Joe Bloggs and his family coming to the school, wasn't it down to the independent school sector to provide some moral leadership and to go beyond the 1% free places and to go beyond the, I think, 25 private schools sponsored state schools in 2019 out of 1,300. These options are open to them. And where was the moral leadership to show that they really are a charitable sector? And now they're landing parents possibly with higher fees because they haven't done it.
I don't think independent schools work together in that sort of way. They're cats, not dogs.
Right.
They may be all in the same room, but they're seeing each other as competitors. They're wanting to plough their own course. There's a lot of history which has allowed them to come away from their old charitable objectives. I mean, if we went down the charitable route, I think my choice would be really tighten up the charitable conditions.
Okay.
Any charity that's running a business ought to be generating 10% of turnover for charity. That ought to be the base. I don't understand why schools are allowed to do less,
Okay.
but they are.
And final question, is it fair to say then that the independent school sector, not all of them, but overall, if they're acting as cats rather than as a group with the moral purpose, has lost its moral purpose?
I think they see their moral purpose in different directions. I think they see their moral purpose in terms of their pupils. And no, in terms of the mission to the country, they remember it. I don't think they would mind finding their way back there. I mean, most of them are teachers who spent time in the state sector too. They're the same people. They would welcome a road back. But while they are where they are, their duties are to their pupils and to do the best by them.
Got it. I think it's brilliant to have Lord Lucas here and hear that perspective. So a big round of applause, please. And thank you so much, Lord Lucas. Thank you. And last but not least, Fiona. Let's have Fiona up. Thank you, Fiona. Orange chair. So Fiona Millar barely needs introducing, but she is a long-standing journalist, author. She helped found Comprehensive Future, which is a brilliant organisation you can find online, and actually was my inspiration for PEPF. And is just all around fantastic, tweeting it at School Truth. So do check her out. Fiona, thank you for coming.
Thank you for asking me.
Not at all. I had a whole series of questions which I was going to ask you, but I was going to say actually, what did you find interesting about what you heard? And I was particularly coming after Lord Lucas, might be probably what everybody wants to hear. Is there anything you wanted to respond or reflect on from what's just gone?
I mean, I found it all fascinating and extremely informative, but probably nothing that I haven't heard before, over the last 20 years, because these arguments don't really move on very far in some senses. And I'm pleased to say that Lord Lucas has taken up one of our campaigning ideas that, state and private schools should get together locally and be obliged to give each other what they need if they're going to have charitable status. But I think there's a fundamental unfairness here. There is a fundamental unfairness here. You've got 500,000 children in the private sector and over 8 million in the state sector, and they're funded at a vastly different rate. And that's just wrong. It's just wrong. So to me, it's a political argument. I'm very interested in all the facts and the figures and everything, but it's a political argument. The poorest children in society should not be funded less well funded than the most well off.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. What would your reform be to get us towards a scenario where that's not the case? And will charitable status removal of that cut it?
No. I mean, I agree with Francis. It's a very small scale reform, but I think it does allow Labour to make a bigger argument if they find the guts to say it, that this is about fairness and it is about having a more equal society, and it is about, ensuring that we don't believe society should be run by these terrible people. I mean, look what they've given us. David Cameron, Brexit, Boris Johnson, Partygate. I mean, I don't know why people are so proud of private schools and what they give their children. It seems to be the public examples we've got of people who've been educated, and some of the best schools in the country are absolutely shocking. Yeah.
Just out of interest, so it was in the 2017 manifesto, putting VAT on private schools. And Keir Starmer, who's been greatly criticised for all sorts of things, especially getting rid of a whole load of pledges that he made before, but has kept this. Yeah. Why do you think he kept it?
Well, I think in a sense it's low-hanging fruit, because you're not really going to affect that many people. And probably about 50% of them aren't going to vote Labour anyway. And then a smaller percentage are going to be overseas students, while it allows you to say you're acting on behalf of the many, not the few. So I think it's a small-scale reform. It's not the biggest reform we need in education. I mean, the biggest reform we need in education is within the state sector. But I'm pleased he's doing it, and I hope it's a precursor of other things like getting rid of grammar schools and all selection. And I'm glad you mentioned selection, because one of the problems with this argument about private schools is we talk about them as if they just take anybody. They don't just take anybody. A lot of them are highly selective, and they also have a nasty habit of getting rid of the young people who aren't going to make the grade. And I've written lots of stories about families who've been pushed out by private schools for one reason or another. So all these other things like bursaries and this, that, and the other, they're all academically selective at the moment. So you are automatically going to weed out the poorest children from benefiting from them.
Got it. Do you think there's public support for the proposal to remove charitable status?
I think in all the time I've been writing about education, apart from possibly after the crash, I can't think of a moment at which there's such a strong sense of unfairness in society. And I think one of the things that came out of the pandemic, and when we did, I come from Camden, I was a parent in Camden, I'm a school governor in Camden, I was educated in Camden, I went to university in Camden. In this area, we did some research talking to young people in Camden, and young people felt very keenly from reading what they read in the papers that the private school children during the pandemic were getting something that they weren't getting. And I think a lot of them hadn't realized that before. They were getting iPads, they were getting this one-to-one tuition through, online at home. And a lot of these kids didn't even have an internet connection. There were families that had one mobile phone between 4 or 5 kids. So I think there's a sense of the unfairness now. And I think Labour is right, to put it crudely, to capitalise on it, but also to amplify it so that people can understand that this is a very unjust society. And even small things, I don't really care whether it's £600, £6 million, £1.7 billion. That isn't the point to me. The point is you're saying that money shouldn't be going to the richest kids. It should be going to the poorest kids.
Got it.
Yeah.
What do you think of media coverage of this topic? There were 2 big Daily Mail front pages. I don't know if you saw, sort of out of the blue. Keir Starmer had announced it ages ago, conference had voted, and then a few months ago, Daily Mail started to run a few kind of attack pages, and then it died down again. But what's your thinking on how media coverage has been of this topic?
Well, I mean, you're never going to win with that one. I mean, but Melissa Benn sitting over there, about 10 years ago, we did a piece for the New Statesman together about where the education backgrounds of all the newspaper editors in what was, then Fleet Street, and all of them went to private schools, probably all sent their children to private schools. I wouldn't really worry about that, because they're always, we spend far too much time defending our position. I even think tonight we find ourselves defending our position. Isn't it awful? We're attacking these poor marginalized private schools, as if they're the victims in this situation. You've got to go on the front foot here and talk about the 8 million children who are in the state schools and what they need. And they need to have exactly the same opportunities as the children in private schools. And I do appreciate the point about parents wanting to do the best for their child. I know that's going to be the prevailing political philosophy for years to come. But the job of government is to do the best for all children, not for a small number of children. And the way to do that is to make sure that the least well-off have exactly the same advantages as the most well-off. Yeah.
Are you at all concerned that Keir Starmer and his team will remove the charitable status, or will apply VAT on school fees, and then the question will be parked for another 100 years? That will be the most reform we ever do. And almost doing just this particular low-hanging fruit means that higher-hanging fruit will be left.
Well, I mean, the high-hanging fruit is abolition, and I don't think you're going to go there. I mean, it's too big a time and energy trap politically. It can be. Say
Francis's reform of 30% of places going to for free or going to a much reduced rate. Are all of those things going to possibly be out of reach?
But how do you choose which children get those places?
I'm not sure on the details of the
You
proposal,
just end up
but
with
I'm
more glorified grammar schools, as far as I can see, won't you? So no, I'm not very keen on that, just plucking a few more children from the state sector, putting them in the private sector. I think the only viable thing to do is to address the issue of charitable status, as everybody has said, by regulating it more closely and making schools more accountable for what they do for their public benefit. I mean, I think at the moment they provide public harm, private schools, not public benefit. So and in return for that, they should be taking in the young people who are most at risk of exclusion, or the ones who've got the most extreme behavioural difficulties or whatever. I don't think the parents in the private schools, at least the ones I know, will be very happy about that, incidentally. I don't believe that they desperately want to be in inclusive schools. I think they're paying not to have their children with the children. They're paying to keep their children away from the poorest children in society. That's part of the deal.
But would you, so is your view then that it might not be the best thing to remove charitable status altogether, but to actually
I don't think it would be. I think it'd be very difficult to remove it altogether. I don't think we've addressed that issue. But these schools like Eton, they've all got these complicated endowments they've had for years and years and years. And so I think a better way to do it is say, right, if you're going to be a charity, you really have to benefit your community, and you have to go to your local state schools. I mean, Ackland, Burley, all the schools around here should get together with the private schools in this area. And instantly, there are more private schools in this part of London, I think, in anywhere else in Western Europe. And it's very bad for air pollution as well.
What would they do?
But I mean, they would get together and they would hear what the state schools want from them. We don't want them to be taking the cleverest children and giving them bursaries. That doesn't help us at all. What we want is them to be giving the state schools what they need, whether it is the teachers in the subject they need, the subject expertise, the sporting facilities, the trips, whatever it is they need. And then they should have to provide it in return for being a charity. Yeah.
Right. And should they have to meet a certain number of places that are free? Do you think? I'm just wondering whether state schools...
I don't like this free place thing. I just think it's like crumbs from a poor man's table. Oh, a few more children will get plucked out.
Well, I'm just wondering whether expertise from private schools is also crumbs from a rich man's table.
No, but you take the expertise you wanted, not what they wanted to give. I mean, there may be things, there are certainly things they do better. We know the extracurricular activities, the enrichment opportunities they have. I mean, just drive along past Kenwood, anybody who lives there, and look at the playing fields that Highgate School's got. I'm not aware that any of the schools my children were involved in were ever invited to go and participate of the facilities there. There was a swimming pool there that you had to pay to join a club to use.
I wonder whether, I think years of interviewing state school teachers, they will say the only thing I need more of is more money. I don't want the optics of busing my child from my state school onto that nice playing field over there, even if it would be nice.
But,
I think most head teachers would say, I just want more money.
Teachers are resources. Or give them resources in kind, Look, I mean, it's not ideal. It's not ideal, but it's better than, if you're not going to get rid of charitable status, they should be working for their money, frankly, harder than they are now.
Do you think then that actually what we're quite worried about is there will be a legal challenge to removing charitable status, and that they would succeed?
Possibly.
That the Independent Schools Council would succeed?
I think that would be a big time and energy trap, again, at a time when, let's not forget, there are many reforms and things that need to happen to the state schools that are educating the majority.
No, it's really, really interesting. So YouGov polling shows that 46% of the public would like charitable status removed from private schools. 13% think they should get to keep their charitable status. They should get to keep their charitable status, and nothing else. Nothing else should change. And about 26% think that they should get to keep their charitable status, but have to do more things. So what you're saying, sort of a bit of what Lord Lucas Diana is saying as well, is in that 26%, 46% say they'd like charitable status scrapped completely. But I guess what your concern is, Fiona, is that wouldn't be legally possible. So we have to bring in more tests.
Well, I think you just got to be realistic about what governments can and can't do and the pressures they're under. And, it's just that would be a very big reform to expend a lot of energy on it, particularly if you're taking on the Daily Mail, let's be honest, and the Daily Telegraph. So you might want to find a way to do it that doesn't waste so much time and energy when you're focusing on other things that might be more important.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. So really, really interesting. Thank you so much, Fiona. Thank you for your time. So we've got just under half an hour for questions, and I'm going to pass around the mic. In fact, I'll just run around with the mic, I think.
Okay. You said in your introduction that you were going to ask us, has our views changed as a result of this tonight? I wonder if you would ask the panel whether they have changed their views as a result of hearing what's been said tonight.
I always change my views when I'm in such good company. I find it a really interesting collection of views. I find the way forward for independent and state education in this country a considerable puzzle. So I'm always very pleased to hear people's ideas.
I'm going to go with one speaker to answer per question. So I know you'll want to hear from everybody, but just for time. So next question. Yes, Alice. Could you direct it at one of the speakers if possible?
Yes, so I suppose suppose probably Lord Lucas. I can't remember your first name, I'm sorry. So I work for Universities UK now, but I used to work for the Sutton Trust, so kind of bear those ideas in mind. So universities are only getting better and better at contextualizing admissions, right? We kind of tend to focus our discussions around private schools, like, oh, they're overrepresented at Oxbridge, la, 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 la. All universities are now getting better, if the Telegraph headlines about social engineering or anything to go by. But in our research, I remember at the Sutton Trust, one of the things that was getting worse was social inclusion in a wider sense. So one of our big reports was called Pulling Away, and it's how the quote unquote elite in Britain are pulling away. There are fewer interclass marriages. There are fewer people who are integrating with people from different backgrounds than themselves. And I think it's been getting worse almost consistently since the 1960s, if I remember that correctly, but please don't quote me. So my concern is not so much about the kind of immediate, are universities getting too many private school kids, are the educational benefits that much better, because actually from a lot of the people I met who went to private schools, the education might not be necessarily that much better. It's usually things like extracurricular, which feed into this division of opportunity. And, increasingly in a cost of living crisis, jobs in the media, jobs like journalism, in any of these competitive fields, it feels are getting less democratic rather than more. And so, do you see, in my head, I feel that private schools should have a responsibility towards if you are looking to be more inclusive in the way that you integrate with the rest of society, then that also has to mean necessarily passing on those softer skills, those social skills, those connections, that, for want of a better word, nepotism. What responsibility do you see private schools having in this space if we are becoming a more and more unequal Britain on a much wider, much broader point than just education? How do you think private schools, if they are going to serve their quote-unquote social good, are going to help address that?
Okay, thank you, Alice. Go for it, Lord Lucas.
I don't know. I'm a great admirer of the Sutton Trust. I think what you're suggesting is a really important direction to find our way in, but I don't have an answer.
Does anybody else want to suggest how private schools could make the country less unequal?
I don't think we should be thinking in terms of expecting private schools to do anything. They're basically businesses, as far as I can see. They will act in their own interest, as will most businesses and most parents and whatever. But I think the job is for government to do that. And the best way for government to do that, in my view, is you've got to have a fully comprehensive education system. So doing anything you can to mitigate the disaster of the sort of fallout to the private sector is part of that. But also you need to have fully comprehensive admissions within the state sector and make sure that state schools are under more obligation to be more inclusive. And that's going to be the best way for society to become a more equal place, I think, generally, and for young people to understand about children from different backgrounds to their own.
Next question, and just a question, that was not you, Alice, but just a question because we're short for time, directed at a speaker, and if it can stay on tax. Yes, Michael.
Thank you. This is for Diane. Thank you for your perspective. I think you said something that really goes to the heart of this issue for a lot of people, which is that actually it isn't about the amount of money spent per pupil or the quality of the provision, but about the peer group and the parents of children who might be at private school. And the idea that other children can be lifted up by being in that peer group. If that's the case, considering Francis's proposals, is there a percentage of the population of a private school at which that peer group would be eroded for you and it would be less attractive? Or alternatively, is there a fee that you think would be too low to keep that culture and ethos?
That's a really tricky question. But to your point, I think that obviously I refer to like-mindedness, and I don't know if there is a way that we can capture that within the state school system. I'm sure that we can if it's a really, really good school, and maybe if there is some form of selection process in that they have taken children that have attained a certain level in an entrance exam. But I think that the parents really do contribute to the outcomes of those children. And if you're in a scenario where maybe there are lots of disadvantaged children, lots of parents who are in social housing or suffering with mental health issues, there are so many other things that matter to them. So their priority might not be to read or to help their child with homework. So there is this big difference, but I don't know how we can eliminate that and almost spread that like-mindedness. So whilst in my children's school, most of the parents tend to think in the same way, but if we had to move into a state school, as those parents start to move into the state school sector, then we can almost bring about change, because other people look to their peers to see how are they performing. It's like one big competition, right? If you think that you're losing the race, you start to speed up. But if you think that you're safe and you're doing well, then you kind of take a back seat. So I think if we can move some of those, that thinking, that like-mindedness into the state school system, we can change it. And I'd be all for that. I don't think it's about money. It's a mindset. It's about how you think. And it's not just that you prioritize education, it's that it's important that you spend time reading with your child, or maybe taking them to the museum, or was that, I'm not sure what they said at the back there, but the point I'm making is it's not just about money. You couldn't just switch the children from state schools into a private school, because equally they would suffer, because they wouldn't be prepared for the level of academic attainment that would be expected of them. There's so many more factors that are at play, not just about money here.
Thanks, Diana. Next question, please. Yeah, can we have this chap here with the hat?
Yeah, thank you. My name is James Whiting. I'm from the Secretary of the Socialist Education Association, which is an affiliate of the Labour Party. So I'll declare my cards before I start. I just want to challenge a couple of things about working class children not wanting to achieve, and working class parents not wanting their children to achieve. I'm afraid that is not the case. They're doing so against all the odds. And EAL children, by the way, are the highest achievers in this country. That is a fact. They learn learning English really quickly. They build on that and become bilingual. And that is incredibly beneficial, as anyone knows, to academic achievement. The other thing is, I think I wanted to say, is that what's happened over the past 10 years is that Conservatives have imposed a private school curriculum on the state sector, and then expected the state sector to compete with the private sector with all its resources and benefits that it has. That is a total con, and it's showing to be a total con, and it's also putting intolerable pressure, I think, on state schools at the moment. We have a crisis in which 75% of teachers in the state sector now think they shouldn't be doing that job. We've got a 42% failure to recruit. They're 42% below target at the moment, recruiting teachers in the state sector. The state sector is it's in crisis, actually. That's the truth of it. Maybe not everywhere, but the most disadvantaged areas are feeling the worst of it. So really my question is, how do we change that, and how do we use that money, that extra money that Starmer wants to raise to make teachers want to teach back in the state sector again?
It's a great question. So how would that 1.75 billion be best used in the state sector? Who feels like they'd be best placed to answer that? We actually don't have a state school teacher up here. Is anybody in the audience who's a teacher who'd like to answer that? Yeah, would you like to stand up and answer the question? More money. There we go. 1.75 billion, whether that would be more or enough money. I think Jeremy Corbyn's view was to do free school meals. Would you have a specific use of the money that you'd prefer? Pay teachers more. I am.
children, you'd have people staying in the job longer. Thank you. Sorry about that. I've got a naturally loud voice anyway. So you'd have people staying in the job longer. You'd have less staff turnover. You'd have less people going off sick, all the things that make teaching hard. You would have teachers able to build better relationships with parents. Maybe you give teachers a bit more time so they can have some time set aside to build links with parents. As a state, I work in a college of further education, but it's very hard to have, you don't have the time that you need to foster the relationships with parents. So I think that's something private schools maybe give the teachers more time to write reports and talk to parents and stuff. And I know from personal experience, I've got people I do a lot of GCSE retakes. I've got people to pass because I've asked their mum to lock them up over half term. So parental involvement is extremely important. And I think it's much harder to do that in a large state school or a large college than it is in a private school where the numbers are small and the class sizes are smaller. So having more money for more teachers, making teachers feel more positive about their work, less stressed. You could go on, but I think money is probably a big factor in that.
I think it's a brilliant answer, absolutely. Just a couple of very quick facts, but teachers are paid less per hour once you include all their preparation work than nurses and police in this country, and FE college teachers are paid on average £9,000 less than their equivalent in the same subject in a state secondary. So working in FE college, you absolutely know what you're talking about. Could we have another question, please? This chap in blue at the back.
I just wanted to ask Diane why she expresses such disdain at her children being around people with special educational needs that don't speak English as a first language. I went to this school, which is incredibly diverse. I've been in lessons with lots of people with special educational needs. I achieved better GCSE grades at this school than most of my friends that went to private school, even though they did easier exams than us. And I don't understand why you're so fearful of children with special educational needs. I think you gain invaluable life experiences from being exposed to them. And I think you're doing more harm than good than shielding your children away from them. Because when they come out of school, they have to navigate, like in this school, they've helped me navigate the world so much better than they do at private school. I go to Counter School for Girls now, which has a lot of people that join from private school for sixth form to try and get into Oxbridge because they think they have better chance of getting in there. And the way that there's just a massive divide, and I just want to know why you're so fearful of everyone else.
Okay, so firstly, it's a good point, and maybe I didn't explain myself when I made my comments, but firstly, to your point, I'm working class, and to your point, I actually have a child who is on the SEND spectrum. She has dyslexia, and if she wasn't in the school that she's in now, the fee-paying school, we would never have known that she is dyslexic. So, sorry? No, he says, his point said that I have disdain for children that are on the SEND spectrum. I don't. My issue is that the schools don't actually have resources to support those children adequately. And my point being, if I were to move my children into those schools, do they have the money to support those children adequately? The answer is no.
They both came to this school, and my son, I mean, I don't know whether they do this in private schools, but the teachers here worked through their holidays. That's how dedicated they are at this school to get my son through his GCSEs. And they set up a whole term throughout the Easter term. They worked, they're not getting, any extra money for it. And they worked their asses off to get these kids. So I think, I get it. I understand why, your perspective, and it's your choice. But I think you have to be really careful when you make these sweeping generalizations. about, you know, my kid had dyslexia and he wouldn't have been picked up. My kids have both gone through the state sector and have been amazingly supported through their dyslexia. It isn't perfect, but for a moment, I sent my kid to a private school, much to my shame, in Camden, because I thought, yes, he's going to be better supported. And it was, in fact, to this day, he says to me, why did you do that to me, Mum? And so I think, you know, everybody has a different experience, but you need to recognize that you can't demonize state school. I think it has come off that you see state schools as some kind of total anathema.
I see it that I'm Black and my children are Black, and there's research that has proven that actually Black children are disadvantaged in the state school sector because there's bias, there's racism, there's stereotype. But there's two questions.
Let's just go one at a time. I think it's definitely a debate that we all understand what's being said on both sides, and it's really valuable to hear both sides. So thank you, and thank you to you at the back as well for bringing your point in. Johannes, my brother. he's sweet, isn't he? Comes and supports me.
I've been made to come. No, I haven't. I'm very glad I'm here. I just had a question for Lord Lucas and Fiona. So from a Conservative perspective and also from a Labour perspective, so what are the next practical and actionable steps that each of your governments could take to solve the problem we're talking about tonight? And what's stopping both of those two parties working together? Because it seems that there might be an inclination to do so. So what are the actual roadblocks here?
So what could Labour and what could Conservatives actually do to move this along properly? It's not your government at all, Fiona, but do you want to?
I'm a member of the Labour Party now, but I mean, I do think there's a bigger question here about how we see state education. So that's why I keep saying I wish it wasn't just a debate about private schools, because two people here have touched on the fundamental issue, which is that state schools are in a crisis, they're underfunded. Any country that cannot recruit enough people to teach its children and look after its sick people is a failing state, in my view. So that has to be a priority to invest in. I'm not going to talk about health, but you've got to make teaching a high status, well-paid occupation and attract back the best graduates, which we're just not doing at the moment. And I think if that starts to happen, you invest more money in state schools, the private schools won't look as attractive anymore. But you've really got to put a lot of elbow grease behind that. It should be a national priority.
And we need to understand as well that it is those terrible figures and stories about the state school system that is what worries parents like Diana. You know, the government have just missed their teacher recruitment target, as touched on by you, by like a catastrophic amount. It barely made the news. So absolutely agreed on that. Lord Lucas, what's stopping the Conservatives from being more brave about private school reform and bringing more poorer children into the system as you'd like?
I don't think the Conservative Party would think that I spoke for them on education, but no, I would like to see more resources in state schools. But I am very distressed by some of the things going on in state schools, which are a real impetus to parents choosing private. Discipline is the first of them. I'm a fan of Michaela. Not every school has to be like that, but the idea that bad discipline should be tolerated, I think, is unacceptable to parents, and we have to understand that children are capable of behaving given a good environment, and that we have to create. The second is that we really need to do something to support aspiration, to support working parents. One of the great reasons parents choose independent education is you don't have to pick them up at 3. You can actually combine it with a job. So working at that, working with parents, letting parents back into state schools. The whole MAT system has excluded parents. They don't have proper representation. They're not listened to. They're not part of the way the school is governed. So yes, so I would. There are various things I would like to see, but I'm not at all sure they're Conservative policy.
Could we have somebody at the back there? Yes, in the puffer jacket.
Yeah. Hello. Yeah, a very simple question. I just wonder if the panel think that the independent sector does provide a better education?
Look,
Somebody who will tell us about the research, which shows that children from broadly similar socioeconomic backgrounds, the difference isn't really that great. The truth is that state schools are teaching a vastly different range of pupils, so the results look very different. I mean, Francis will probably know the answer to that.
Could you give us the GCSEs?
The research tells us that in terms of kind of narrow academic subjects, there's a cumulative small gain at every stage. So at any one stage, it's it's there, but it's not enormous. But if you have someone in private school all the way through from 5 till 18, that it does make a difference. But interestingly, I'll let you in on the very latest research, which we've done, which hadn't even published yet. Looking at GCSEs in the last 5 years, which is suggesting that difference on maths and English, this kind of real core, has narrowed and is not necessarily in favour of private schools over the state schools. Bearing in mind, what this research has to do is precisely what Fiona said. You have to control for the fact that the children are coming from very, very different backgrounds. So you're really trying to look at the value added compared to when they came to the school and when they leave and so on and so forth. So the research is not easy, but I've been leading teams that have done this research now for a number of years. And yeah, in terms of the pure academics, your money or your peer effects does deliver. That doesn't measure the things which the gentleman at the back, for example, mentioned, which is like the experience of a broader population, or a wider education, learning how society ticks. It's the social segmentation which gets me more than anything else.
Thank you, Francis. I'm just only going to take two more, the two that I've been seeing, and then we're going to do our poll. So this gentleman here, first of all, with the moustache. Yep.
Why do we do so badly in Europe compared to other similar countries?
Sorry, say that again.
Why are we doing so badly in education compared to similar countries in Europe?
I haven't got the latest data on that, but I'm going to go to...
Scandinavian countries have no private schools, they have no grammar schools, and their educational outcomes are much better than this country's.
Yeah, let's look at the evidence. So I don't know the latest evidence on that. Thank you.
Particularly Finland, you're referring to, which always comes top or near the top of the so-called PISA tables and so on and so forth. And there's no definitive answer to the question, but it's undoubtedly true that teachers are paid a lot more in Finland, relatively speaking. And it's kind of more social respect for the teaching profession, and it's much more comprehensive systems. There are no privates. There are no fee-paying schools. But that's just the one country. Finland is one small country, and so there are lots of lots of other countries around. Obviously, some do better, some do worse than Britain. And I'm not sure how much you can actually read collectively over the general performance of other countries across Europe. One thing I would say is the scores are much more unequal in our country than elsewhere, and these are reflected in the fact that we are a more unequal country than most of the European countries.
Yeah, boarding schools is a whole nother topic. It's, yeah.
The boarding schools.
Yeah, thank you so much, Simon. It's a really important point. I did say I'd just take one more question. So there is this important point about boarding schools. I did read a report by the OECD the other day, which said that what we do know about countries across the whole OECD, which I think is 46 countries, is that those with private schools overall don't have any better educational outcomes. So that is an interesting find. This last gentleman who's been eyeballing me for ages in a grey sweater, and then we're going to go to the poll, and I'm really sorry to everybody else who couldn't get their question in.
Hi, I'm the district secretary for Camden National Education Union, so I've probably been to most schools in Camden. The only difference I've really seen in the state schools in Camden and the private ones is the cultural capital share between the parent groups and the resources. When I go into a private school, one of the first things I'm noticing is I'm pricing up the furniture and thinking that if that was sold, that money could go to Burley, Lasante Union, Regent High, and what we could do with that money. But the question I wanted to ask, and Fiona might be able to answer this, lots of the discussions about sharing resources, so private schools being able to provide stuff to their local schools, it seems to be around an age group which is more secondary. And by that point, the inequality is almost baked in. I don't want to be too defeatist, but really the type of parents from working class backgrounds who are those ones who are more often than not talking about getting their kids into private schools, taking them to the museums at the weekend, reading with them. If you're having to work 3 jobs and you're struggling to put food on the table, and your own reading skills aren't that good, then you've already your kids are at a disadvantage by the age of 2. It's not about when they're doing their GCSEs and A-levels. So really, should we be having a conversation which is much more about funding early years education, primary school education, than this sort of trying to fix it at the later stages?
It's a great question. I'm going to give that to Fiona.
I think you're right, and I'm guilty of this myself, is that the private school discussion does tend to take place around secondary education, and that is a terrible mistake. I totally agree with you about front-loading the resourcing, because it would make such a big difference. But I do have to say at this point, in response to some of the sort of stereotypical things we've heard about state schools, there are state schools, primary schools in Camden that do a fantastic job with children from very disadvantaged backgrounds. They really do. And they do narrow the gap. And we've got to celebrate that fact. And I think one of the problems with this debate is there's so much ignorance in a way on both sides, and that's because we've got a very divided education system. So the aspiration must be to have a more inclusive education system across the piece for everybody. And I think the OECD does also show that the most successful educations in systems in the world do tend to be the ones that don't segregate children from a very early age. That's correct, isn't it? So that should be our aspiration. Yeah.
On which note, we are now going to, big thank you to all of our panel. And thank you especially to those who do come here to defend their views. So we really are appreciative. Thank you very much. We're now going to do a poll, if it works. We've obviously had some tech issues so far. So Tom, our amazing coordinator at PEPF, knows what's going to happen next. Oh, is it not? Okay, what we're going to do? No, what we're going to do is we can try a show of hands, shall we, Tom? All right. So let's go through to the 3 questions, the 3 options. Where are they? Oh, I see. Okay, I'm going to speak them then. So I'll say them, and then I'll say, put your hands up for 1, put your hands up for 2, put your hands up for 3. So number 1 is private schools should be able to keep their tax exemptions and the situation remains as it is, number 1. Number 2, private schools should be able to keep their tax exemptions, but be under much stricter obligations of how they get to keep the status, such as 20% free places. Number 3, private schools are businesses and should be required to pay normal business taxes. So number 1, hands up for the scenario continuing as it is, because it's not really representative of the country, is it? But including our panel, however, that does seem to be something nobody really wants. Number 2, private schools should get to continue to keep charitable tax status, and please do also vote, panel, if you'd like to. But there are significant new constraints on them. Put your hands up if you would agree with that reform. Yeah, so we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yeah. And last but not least, charities are businesses and they should have their charitable tax status removed. And that's the whole audience. Okay, so thank you very much, everybody. It's really been good to have you. Help yourself to tea and drinks.
Last but not least, you can get involved with PEPF, and all the details are up on the board.
We're all born artists. The problem is to remain an artist as we grow up. That was Pablo Picasso. And I think we've got to help our kids, all our kids, aim high in life. Not just high, but higher than high. We've got to help our kids find their passion, their art. So I'm Nick Corsten. I'm just a dad. I'm co-founder of STEAMco. One day maybe I'll be the CEO, I don't know. So STEAMco is a non-profit community enterprise that helps connect our kids with their art and our communities with their schools by running creativity days. And we want to get the whole community involved. We want people who've had kids, not had kids, got kids, whatever, to come and work with us to help us run these days.
It's magic! It's magical!
What inspired me? Well, I saw a talk by Sir Ken Robinson. I read half a book called What's the Point of School? On what we should be teaching our kids. And I went to Camp Bestial, which is really a Glastonbury for kids. And I thought, I want this in my kids' school. I've got a lovely little film my dad gave me of me when I was 1 and him with my first ever train set. And I show that to kids in schools all over the country. And how my dad gave me the greatest gift. He gave me my art. Because art is what we call it when what we do might connect us to somebody else. So art could be painting, it could be photography, it could be cooking, it could be coding, it could be dancing, it could be design, it could be DJing, it could be robots, it could be rockets. The fun, the excitement that we have making and firing rockets in schools is to be seen, to be believed.
This is the best day of my life.
This truck contains everything you need to run a creativity festival in a primary school. 30 coding kits with the BBC Microbit. We've got rocket making kits. We do cardboard challenge. We can do the egg drop. We've got a t-shirt printing machine so we can print I Love Art t-shirts. So the kids design their own logo, take a selfie. We've had thousands of posters of those done. That's with JR, French street artist JR. So we've got communities all over the country designing I Love Art logos, taking photos, and we sent them off to JR, and he's printed 1,000 of these off for us, which we're fly posting all over the country. So in lockdown, we got an Arts Council grant and we built a green screen TV studio. We've been live streaming events all summer. We did a 3-day Glastonbury event where we built a half-sized pyramid stage from cardboard and code and ran 3-day events. We had Martin and Gary Kemp. We had Glenn Matlock from the Sex Pistols on stage alongside community artists, dads and their kids. And we had a young lad from Leeds called Nenny who played his piano on stage, all virtual.
We learnt a lot in lockdown, and as soon as it lifted, we took it out on the road. We built a cardboard Coventry Cathedral, itself optimistically rebuilt after the war, and took it all around the country. With our green screen magic, kids could perform on a stage. And we launched it to inspire them to aim higher than high with their art. Inspired by Elon Musk's vision to take 1 million people to Mars in 30 years, we built a cardboard Mars base camp with a 150-foot tall starship. Now we need people and organisations to collaborate for creativity.
For me, collaboration is everything.
Elton John gave me the greatest gift. Actually, he made a film, I don't know if you saw it, with John Lewis, where basically he tells the story of how he was given a piano as a kid and worked hard and made literally 1 million. I saw that film, ripped it off, put our own subtitles on it, and Elton John retweeted it. It had 50,000 views in an hour, and I went on a 2-week UK tour from Cornwall all the way to Carlisle, showing that film, showing my train set film, talking to kids about art and creativity, letting off rockets, and inspiring schools across the country in our 12 days of Creative Christmas tour.
You've inspired one little boy in particular, a very quiet boy, and as that rocket shot into the air, we heard the word blast off come out of his mouth.
Innovation, technology, and dreams rocketing up to the sky.
The state education system, we have a lot of people feel it's been narrowed and narrowed and narrowed, focusing on teaching and testing of highly academic subjects, which are important, which are right for some kids, but it's not for everybody. And some kids come out of the education system literally broken. 9 out of 10 schools in Britain have reported cutting the arts in some way or another, which is a real tragedy. And we're going to lose that cutting edge creativity that made Britain so famous. Creativity is Great Britain, after all. The ideal future for me would be a whole load of these trucks on the road with passionate, enthusiastic, committed, creative people, helping connect kids with their art and communities with their schools all the way across the UK. As Albert Einstein said, imagination can take us anywhere.
I would like to have STEAM code day in my classroom because we get to learn about what's inside stuff and things. I like science because you get to make stuff. You can describe people who